The New Mexico desert stretched wide and endless, a land of burnt earth and jagged rock, where the only law was the one a man enforced himself. The sun sat low in the sky, staining the horizon deep red, as if the land itself had already tasted blood and was ready for more. Jake Mercer sat on his porch, boots kicked up, a mug of black coffee in one hand, a rifle resting across his lap. His eyes scanned the hills, the way a wolf watches a clearing, quiet, patient, waiting. The silence was peaceful, but it wasn't real. He could feel it. Something was coming. Bear, his black German shepherd, lay at his feet, ears twitching. The dog hadn't moved all afternoon, but now he lifted his head, his nose flaring as he sniffed the wind. His muscles tensed. Jake exhaled slowly and took another sip of coffee. So, it's finally happening. For the past week, he had noticed the signs. Tire tracks in the dirt that didn't belong to him. A cigarette butt near the fence line. The brand wasn't American. A vulture picking at something in the brush that wasn't roadkill. He had spent 20 years learning how to read a battlefield before the first shot was fired, and this was a battlefield waiting to happen. And now, they were here. He heard the engines first, 3 of them, moving fast, kicking up dust as they approached from the valley road. Black SUVs, the kind the cartel liked, the kind that rolled into towns before people went missing. Jake stood, setting his coffee down on the wooden railing. Bear was already on his feet, ears pinned back, a low growl building in his throat. The truck slowed as they neared the front gate, idling just outside the property line. Jake could see the figures inside, their silhouettes barely visible through the tinted glass. The driver's side door swung open, and a man stepped out. Tall, broad shoulders, expensive boots that didn't belong on dirt. His button-up shirt was tucked neatly into his belt, a gold pistol hanging from his hip. Jake recognized the type. He wasn't the muscle, he was the mouth. The man took a few steps forward, his hands held out to his sides, like he was offering peace. Jake didn't move. "Senor Mercer?" the man called, his Spanish accent thick, his voice smooth, practiced. "You are a hard man to reach." Jake said nothing. The man let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head. "You're a quiet one. I like that." He gestured toward the land behind Jake. "It's beautiful. The kind of land a man should be proud of." Jake finally spoke, his voice calm, steady. "What do you want?" The man smiled. "My name is Emilio Ruiz. I represent some businessmen who have taken an interest in your land. They wish to discuss a transaction." Jake's eyes flicked toward the SUVs, too many men inside, more than necessary for a conversation. "I'm not selling," Jake said. Ruiz sighed as if he had expected the answer. He placed a hand on his hip, his fingers resting casually near the gold-plated pistol. "Senor Mercer, I understand your attachment to this place, but you are only one man, and my employers, they are many. It would be unfortunate if you did not take their generosity seriously." Jake took a slow breath through his nose. There it was, the threat. Bear growled louder, taking a step forward. Ruiz smiled. "You have a good dog, Senor Mercer." He tilted his head. "I would hate to see anything happen to him." Jake's jaw tightened, but his voice remained cold. "Leave." Ruiz exhaled, shaking his head as if disappointed. "I will return in 2 days, Senor Mercer. Think on our offer." He turned toward the SUVs, but paused, looking over his shoulder. "Or don't. But if you don't, my employers will send someone less patient." Jake watched as he climbed back into the SUV. The vehicles rumbled back to life, reversing out of the property. The dust settled in their wake. Bear kept growling, watching the road until the last sign of them was gone. Jake ran a hand through his short, graying hair. He knew this day would come. For 5 years he had kept to himself, tending his land, enjoying the quiet life he had fought so damn hard for. But the cartel didn't care about a man's peace. They only cared about control. And now they thought he was just another rancher they could push off his land. They had no idea who he really was. Jake sighed and turned toward the house. It was time to get ready. Preparations for war. By the next morning, Jake had set the first traps. The land he owned wasn't just ranch land, it was a fortress waiting to be activated. He moved with deliberate precision, setting booby traps near the fence line, placing concealed spike strips where the SUVs would likely roll in, and digging up the old supply cache he had buried years ago. The wooden crate was heavy, and when he pried it open, the smell of oiled steel and gunpowder filled the air. Inside, his past waited for him. A suppressed MK-18 carbine, several Glock 19s, combat knives, flashbangs, claymore mines, and enough ammunition to hold off a small army. He strapped a pistol to his thigh, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and moved to the next phase. By the time he was done, his land had become a kill zone. He stepped back onto his porch, his eyes scanning the horizon. He had spent his life eliminating threats in the shadows, dismantling warlords, toppling terrorist organizations. And now, he was going to remind the cartel why men like him don't retire. Jake sat back down in his chair, rifle resting in his lap, and poured himself another cup of coffee. He had 2 days before they came back. Let them come. He was ready. The 2 days passed in silence. Jake Mercer spent them watching the land, moving through the shadows of his own property like a predator waiting for the inevitable. He knew they would come back, and he knew they wouldn't be smiling this time. The first morning, he reinforced his perimeter. He checked the tripwires, tested the explosives, and made sure the spike strips were well hidden beneath loose dirt. The second morning, he loaded magazines, filled canteens, and set up his escape routes. Not because he planned on running, but because he planned on herding them exactly where he wanted. And then, the third day came. It started with a low rumble in the distance, the kind of sound that didn't belong out here in the desert, the kind that meant engines. Lots of them. Jake sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee in his hand, Bear lying at his feet. The dog wasn't relaxed this time. His ears were pinned back, his muscles coiled, his teeth bared in a quiet snarl. The dust cloud on the horizon thickened. It wasn't just 1 or 2 trucks this time. It was 6. Jake took a slow sip of coffee and exhaled. So, they wanted to do this the hard way. The convoy rolled up to the entrance of his property, stopping just outside the barbed wire fence. Jake counted at least 15 men stepping out. Rifles, body armor, tactical movements. Not just cartel enforcers, hired guns, mercenaries. They weren't here to talk, and neither was he. The same man from before, Emilio Ruiz, stepped out from the front vehicle, adjusting his gold-plated pistol. His smile was gone. "Senor Mercer?" he called, voice calm but colder now. "I was hoping we could avoid this." Jake took another sip of coffee and set the cup down beside him. "Then you should have stayed home." Ruiz chuckled, shaking his head. "You have no idea what's coming, viejo." He turned to his men, giving a sharp nod. Jake barely moved before they raised their weapons. The first gunshot cracked the silence. But it didn't come from them. It came from him. Jake fired first, his rifle's suppressed shot barely a whisper, as the round punched through the first man's skull. The mercenary collapsed instantly, his rifle clattering onto the dirt. For a moment, there was nothing but shock. Then, everything exploded. Gunfire ripped through the morning air, cartel soldiers scattering for cover, moving behind trucks and fence posts, unloading bullets toward the house. But Jake was already gone. He moved through the shadows, weaving between cover, disappearing into the terrain. He had spent years studying battlefields, learning how to blend into his environment, and here, on his own land, he was untouchable. One of the mercenaries tried flanking left, creeping around the side of the barn. Jake saw him first. The man moved low, gun raised, scanning, thinking he had the advantage. Jake dropped him with a single shot to the throat. The man crumpled without a sound. More cartel soldiers moved up, firing wildly, sending bullets punching through wooden fences, splintering trees. They were used to overwhelming force, to making men panic and run. Jake didn't run. Instead, he lured them deeper. 2 more soldiers pushed toward the barn. Jake waited until they were right on top of his tripwire. The explosion ripped through the ground, sending both men flying, their bodies slamming against the side of a truck. One of them tried crawling away, legs shattered, moaning. Jake put him down with a clean shot. The cartel was panicking now. They had the numbers, but they weren't fighting a farmer. They were fighting a ghost from the past. One of the hired mercenaries screamed into his radio. "He's picking us off! We need reinforcements!" Jake smirked from his hiding spot, crouched low behind a rock formation near the ridge. That was the moment he was waiting for. The remaining gunmen rushed for the main house, thinking they could flush him out. They moved as a unit, sweeping left and right, covering each other's positions. That's when Jake set off the claymores. The line of hidden explosives detonated in a chain reaction, sending fire and shrapnel tearing through the formation. The men didn't even have time to scream before they were shredded by the blasts. Ruiz, somehow still alive, staggered back, his gold-plated pistol shaking in his hand. He looked around at the burning trucks, at the bodies of his men scattered across the dirt. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "You're just one man." Jake stepped out from the shadows, rifle raised, blood splattered across his vest. His voice was steady. "That's where you fucked up, Ruiz." Ruiz lifted his pistol, trying to get a shot off. Jake fired first. The round punched through Ruiz's chest, the force of it knocking him off his feet, sending him sprawling onto the dirt. For a moment, Ruiz lay there, gasping, blood pooling beneath him. Jake approached slowly, standing over him, looking down as the cartel lieutenant struggled for air. "You should have listened when I told you to leave," Jake said. Ruiz coughed, blood dripping from his lips. You don't know what you've done." Jake knelt, pressing his pistol to the man's forehead. "Yeah, I do." He pulled the trigger, the body went still. The desert was silent again. Smoke curled from burning vehicles. The air smelled like gunpowder and death. Jake exhaled, rolling his shoulders, the fight finally over. Bear trotted up beside him, sniffing one of the bodies before looking up at him, waiting. Jake ran a hand through the dog's fur, nodding. "It's done, boy." He stood, scanning the wreckage, knowing one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Ruiz had been important, but he wasn't the top. That meant someone else was coming, someone bigger. Jake sighed and walked back toward the house. He needed more bullets. The desert smelled of blood, burnt oil, and gunpowder. The bodies of cartel soldiers lay scattered across the dirt, some half buried under the wreckage of their own vehicles, others sprawled where they had fallen in the firefight. The sun was rising now, casting long shadows over the battlefield that had once been Jake Mercer's quiet ranch. Bear sniffed at the body of a dead mercenary before trotting back toward the porch, his black fur streaked with dust. Jake followed, his boots crunching over spent shell casings. He slung his rifle over his shoulder, exhaling as he stepped over Ruiz's lifeless corpse. The bastard never should have come here, but the fight wasn't over. Jake knew the Valdez cartel wasn't going to let this slide. He had just wiped out a hit squad, killed their lieutenant, and left a trail of destruction that couldn't be ignored. If Valdez hadn't taken him seriously before, he sure as hell would now. And that meant the real fight was coming. He walked back to the house, stepping onto the blood-splattered porch. The wood beneath his boots creaked softly, a sound that felt out of place after the roaring chaos of the past few hours. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the metal pot still sitting on the stovetop, taking a slow sip, his fingers still stained with gunpowder. His body ached, bruised ribs, a few cuts along his arms from flying shrapnel, but nothing broken. He'd had worse. Hell, he'd survived worse. He took a deep breath, exhaling through his nose. Now, it was time to prepare. By midday, Jake had buried the bodies. He didn't do it out of respect. He did it to make sure no one found them before he was ready. He stripped them of their weapons, radios, and body armor, tossing the gear into a pile behind the barn. Extra ammo, extra firepower. He was going to need it. The cartel would be back, and this time, they'd bring everything they had. Jake checked his rifle one last time before stepping into the shed at the back of the property. It was time to wake up the past. Inside, hidden beneath an old workbench, was a locked steel trunk, something he hadn't touched since the day he left the military. He crouched down, ran his fingers over the cold metal, then grabbed the key from around his neck. The lock clicked open. Jake lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in foam padding, were the tools of war: a heavily customized MK-18 carbine, a Glock 19, fragmentation grenades, and enough magazines to fight a small war. He ran his hand over the rifle, feeling the weight of it, the familiarity. He had carried this weapon through countless missions, across continents, through firefights and kill zones. It had been part of him, a lifeline, a reaper in his hands, and now he needed it again. Jake slung the rifle over his shoulder, grabbed 2 extra mags, and walked outside. The sun was dipping lower, and the wind was picking up, the desert whispering its warnings. The cartel wouldn't be subtle next time. This was going to be a war. At sunset, Jake stood on the roof of the barn, binoculars in hand, scanning the horizon. The first sign of movement came from the south, a cloud of dust curling into the sky. Engines, multiple vehicles, they were coming. Jake adjusted the focus, watching as the convoy emerged from the distance. 3 SUVs, 1 armored truck. Maybe 20 men. Not just enforcers this time, killers. They had learned from Ruiz's failure. This wasn't just a hit squad, this was a full-on death squad. Jake climbed down, moving quickly but methodically. He grabbed his radio, switching frequencies, tapping into one of the stolen cartel radios from the bodies he had stripped earlier. Static filled the speaker, followed by the sound of voices barking orders in Spanish. Approaching now, no signs of resistance yet. The house is intact. A pause. Check the barn first. Jake smirked. They were walking straight into it. He took his rifle, made sure the grenades were secured in his vest, then positioned himself in the shadows just outside the barn, waiting. The first SUV pulled up, dust swirling around the tires as the cartel soldiers piled out. They moved cautiously, their weapons raised, sweeping the area in tight formations. Jake watched as 2 men broke off toward the barn's entrance. He closed his eyes. Wait for it. The first one kicked the door open. The second stepped inside. A heartbeat passed. Then, boom. The shotgun trap inside the barn detonated, sending a storm of buckshot into the first man's chest, dropping him instantly. The second soldier barely had time to react before Jake opened fire, his rifle spitting suppressed rounds into the dim light. The second man collapsed, his body twitching in the dirt. The others outside shouted in panic, moving for cover. Jake relocated, slipping around the side of the house as return fire tore through the barn walls, splintering wood and kicking up dust. The ambush had worked. Now, it was time to finish them. Jake moved fast, flanking around the side of the house, staying low in the tall grass. He sighted a cartel enforcer taking cover behind one of the SUVs and squeezed the trigger. The round punched through the man's head. One down, another turned, firing wildly, bullets sparking off the metal siding of the barn. Jake threw a grenade toward the truck, then rolled into a crouch as the explosion rocked the night, sending the vehicle's frame bursting into flames. Screams followed, more gunfire. Jake moved through the chaos like a ghost, picking them off one by one. A shot to the gut, a knife to the throat, a bullet between the eyes. One of the mercenaries tried to run back toward the armored truck. Jake lined up the shot. The man fell face first into the dirt. The remaining cartel soldiers, realizing the battle was lost, began retreating, scrambling toward the last surviving vehicle. Jake let them run, let them pile into the truck. Then, as they sped toward the road, he detonated the last charge. The explosion flipped the vehicle into the air, sending it crashing onto its roof, flames roaring into the night sky. Jake reloaded, exhaled, and walked toward the wreckage. Inside, the driver was barely alive, coughing blood, pinned beneath the dashboard. His eyes flickered toward Jake, full of fear and disbelief. "You?" the man gasped. "You're not a farmer?" Jake knelt, gripping the man's collar, dragging him halfway out of the burning wreckage. "No," he said coldly. "I'm the man your boss should have left alone." Then he pressed his pistol against the man's forehead and pulled the trigger. The message is sent. By sunrise, the bodies were gone. Jake loaded them into the remaining cartel trucks, drove them south, and left them at the edge of the border, right outside a known cartel outpost. A message, a warning: stay away. Back at the ranch, Jake cleaned his rifle, refilled his ammo, and waited. Because he knew Valdez wasn't finished, the real war was about to begin. The desert was still, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace, but the silence before a storm. The bodies were gone, the last of the cartel's hit squad buried beneath the weight of their own arrogance. The wreckage of their truck still burned in the distance, black smoke curling into the sky, a signal to anyone watching that Jake Mercer was not a man to be trifled with. Back on the porch, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. His hands were steady, his heartbeat calm. He had spent a lifetime in combat, first in the jungles, then in the mountains, and now, here, in the desert, he called home. Death had been his trade, and even though he had walked away from that life, violence had a way of finding him again. Bear sat at his feet, ears twitching, eyes locked on the horizon. The dog could sense it too. Trouble wasn't done knocking. Then, the radio on the dead cartel enforcer's vest crackled to life. Static buzzed. A voice followed, deep and slow, dripping with cold amusement. I expected you to be a problem, Senor Mercer, but not like this." Jake sipped his coffee, watching the distant hills. He recognized the voice, Hector Valdez, the man who sat atop the empire of blood and drugs that stretched from Mexico to the US border, the man who had sent men to kill him, expecting an easy victory. Jake pressed the transmit button. "You should have sent more men." A chuckle. "You kill my men, and you think that's the end of it?" "No," Jake said. "I think that's just the start." Silence. Then Valdez exhaled slowly. "You're a hard man to kill. I respect that. But respect only goes so far. You have made this personal. You cost me money. You killed my lieutenant. And you left bodies outside my outpost like a dog marking his territory." A pause. "I am not a man who forgives." Jake leaned forward, setting his coffee down on the wooden railing. "I'm not a man who forgets." Valdez let the words hang before speaking again. "Then I'll make sure you remember this moment, viejo. Because when I send my men this time, I will not send amateurs. I will send ghosts, killers trained for war, men who know how to hunt. You will not see them coming. You will not hear them. And when the sun rises, your ranch will be nothing but ashes, and your body will be hanging from a tree for the coyotes to pick clean." Jake took a slow breath. His grip tightened around the radio. "Then you better send a lot of them." The transmission cut out. The line went dead. Jake exhaled. War was coming, and he was going to meet it head on. The next 6 hours were spent in motion, fortifying, preparing. He stripped weapons from the dead men, laying them out on his workbench in neat rows. AK-47s, M4 carbines, handguns, grenades. The cartel had come well armed, and now their weapons belonged to him. He checked his land, making sure the traps were still in place. The claymores near the main gate were hidden, ready to send the first wave of attackers into the air. He reinforced the barn, placing extra ammunition and water inside in case he needed a fallback position. By the time he finished, his land was no longer a ranch. It was a battlefield. Bear trotted beside him as he walked the perimeter, sniffing the air, ears pricked up. The dog could sense it, the way the wind shifted, the way the land itself seemed to hold its breath. Jake slung his rifle over his shoulder and walked back to the porch. Then he waited, and just before midnight, they came. The first sign was the wind carrying the faint sound of engines approaching from the south. More than last time, a lot more. Jake knelt on the roof of his barn, rifle resting on the bipod, scanning the horizon through his scope. They had learned. They weren't coming in a convoy this time. No headlights, no roaring engines. They were moving in slow, controlled formations. He counted at least 30 men, maybe more, some moving along the dirt road, others flanking through the brush, spreading out. Professional, tactical, not cartel grunts. Valdez had sent killers. They were a mile out and closing fast. Jake's heartbeat didn't change. His breathing stayed slow, controlled. He wasn't afraid. This was his world. This was where he thrived. He adjusted the windage, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot punched through the skull of a man moving near the tree line, dropping him instantly. The second shot hit a second man in the throat, sending him spinning backward into the dirt. The rest of them scattered, barking orders, diving for cover. They had expected an ambush. They hadn't expected a ghost. Jake shifted position, rolling to the next vantage point before they could get a bead on him. His rifle spoke again, and another man fell. Then the real attack started. The cartel hit squad opened fire, rounds snapping through the air, kicking up dust as they moved toward the ranch. They weren't panicking. They were pressing forward, covering each other's positions. Jake smiled. Good. That meant they weren't running away. He detonated the first claymore. The explosion lit up the night, sending 2 men flying, their bodies slamming into the dirt with wet thuds. The rest hesitated, regrouping, trying to find another way in. Jake moved to his second position behind an old tractor, firing short, controlled bursts. He dropped 2 more before they even spotted him. Then came the helicopter. The low thump of rotors cut through the air as a blacked-out MD-500 gunship swept over the ridge, its spotlight scanning the ranch. Jake cursed under his breath. Valdez wasn't just throwing men at the problem, he was throwing everything. The chopper swung around, minigun spooling up, and then the world turned to fire. Bullets tore through the barn, ripping wooden beams apart, sending debris flying. Jake dove for cover, rolling behind a rusted water tank as the gunfire tore apart his position. Bear yelped and bolted toward the house, just barely dodging the gunfire. Jake gritted his teeth. He needed to take the chopper out. Now, he sprinted to the main house, grabbing the RPG he had pulled from one of the dead cartel enforcers earlier. He loaded a rocket, ran outside, and lined up the shot. The helicopter turned toward him. Jake fired. The rocket streaked through the air and slammed into the gunship's tail, sending it spiraling out of control. The chopper clipped the barn, exploding in a fireball as it smashed into the ground. The remaining cartel soldiers froze. Jake stood in the firelight, his rifle in hand, blood streaked across his face. He raised the radio he had taken from Ruiz's corpse, pressed the button, and spoke 3 words. "Send more men." Then he started shooting again. The burning wreckage of the helicopter cast flickering light across the battlefield, making the desert floor glow with shifting shadows. Jake Mercer stood in the open, rifle in hand, the smell of gunpowder and burning fuel thick in the air. The night was alive with the sounds of war, crackling flames, distant moans of the dying, the rhythmic pulse of his own breathing. The cartel's elite hit squad had expected a farmer. Instead, they had walked into a war zone, facing a man who had spent decades perfecting the art of combat. They thought numbers would overwhelm him. They were wrong. Across the field, the remaining soldiers hesitated, shaken by the sudden and violent turn of events. The helicopter had been their trump card, their death from above, and now it lay in ruins, burning against the cold desert air. Jake could see them regrouping, gathering behind their armored truck, their leader barking orders in Spanish. They were trying to regain control of the situation, but he could see it in their movements. They weren't attacking anymore. They were surviving. His radio crackled, still tuned to the stolen cartel frequency. A frantic voice cut through the static. Unidad 1 está comprometida. Necesitamos refuerzos. Repito, necesitamos refuerzos ahora. The bastards were calling for backup. Jake exhaled slowly. Not happening. He shouldered his rifle, aimed at the cartel lieutenant giving orders, and squeezed the trigger. The man's head snapped back, his body crumbling to the dirt before the words could finish leaving his lips. Chaos followed. Some of the remaining gunmen broke ranks and ran, disappearing into the darkness, their courage burning out like the flames licking the sky. The rest opened fire, trying to pin Jake down, trying to force him into the open. He wasn't that stupid. He moved, quick and silent, slipping into the shadows. The terrain was his ally. He had memorized every inch of this land, every rock and ridge, every place he could disappear into. The cartel had come hunting him. Now they were the ones being hunted. The first man came too close. He was moving fast, cutting through the brush, eyes scanning for any sign of movement. Jake let him pass, waited until the man was just a step ahead, then struck. A brutal hand wrapped around the man's mouth, silencing him as Jake drove his knife deep into his kidney. The man let out a muffled scream, his body jerking violently before going limp. Jake dragged him into the darkness, taking his radio, his ammo, and his sidearm. Then he moved again. 2 more gunmen were working together, sweeping left, rifles raised, expecting resistance. Jake let them get comfortable, let them feel in control. Then he shot the first one in the kneecap. The man collapsed with a scream, writhing in the dirt, clutching his ruined leg. His partner spun, panic flashing in his eyes, and then Jake's knife was in his throat. The second man hit the ground, his lifeblood soaking into the sand. The first was still alive, crying, pleading. Jake crouched beside him, voice low, calm. "How many more?" The man coughed, pain making his words shake. Más en camino. More on the way. Jake exhaled. "Then you won't need this." He pressed his pistol against the man's forehead and pulled the trigger. The last 3 cartel soldiers had abandoned their offensive completely. They had retreated to the armored truck, the only cover they had left. Jake could hear them arguing, their voices rising in fear and frustration. One of them was on the radio. "We're under attack. No es un maldito granjero, es un maldito soldado." Not a farmer, a soldier. The truth had finally sunk in. Jake took his time. He found the high ground, moving up the ridge, rifle at the ready. The truck's reinforced armor would protect them from casual fire. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had parked in the open, He sighted in, found the exposed fuel line near the rear wheel, and fired. The bullet sparked. The explosion that followed lit up the night. The truck flipped, metal twisting, shrapnel ripping through the air. 2 of the remaining men were instantly vaporized, their bodies torn apart by the force of the blast. The last man was still alive, thrown clear from the wreckage, his body broken, his breathing ragged. Jake approached slowly, pistol in hand. The man coughed, blood dribbling from his lips. "Por favor." Jake crouched down, staring into his eyes. "Tell Valdez what happened here." The man blinked, barely understanding. Jake pressed the muzzle of his gun against the man's cheek. "Tell him I'm coming for him." Then he stood, turned, and left the man to die in the dirt. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. Jake walked back toward his house, his boots leaving prints in the blood-stained sand. The cartel had tried to take his land, his home. They had come thinking he was just an old man with a rifle, a nobody, a speck in their empire. Now they knew the truth. He was death-walking. Inside, he grabbed the radio, switched frequencies, and pressed the button. "Hector Valdez," he said, his voice low, steady. Silence on the other end. Then, a chuckle. "Senor Mercer." Jake set his rifle down on the counter, rolling his shoulders. "I'm coming for you." Valdez exhaled slowly. "You think this is over? I have armies. I have men who would burn the world for me." Jake poured himself a drink, took a sip. "You don't have enough." Valdez chuckled again. "We will see, viejo. We will see." The line went dead. Jake placed the radio down, staring at the desert outside his window. He knew what was coming. The cartel wouldn't just send soldiers next time. They'd send everything. And when they did, he'd be ready. The night was quiet. Too quiet. Jake Mercer sat in his kitchen, the dim glow of a single lantern casting long shadows across the room. His rifle rested against the table, freshly cleaned, magazines stacked neatly beside it. Outside, Bear sat by the front door, his ears twitching, eyes locked on the darkness beyond the porch. The dog knew what Jake knew. This wasn't over. Valdez had taken the bait. His men had been slaughtered, his operation humiliated, and now he had no choice but to retaliate with everything he had left. Jake exhaled, taking a slow sip of whiskey. His hands were steady. His heartbeat was the same as it always was before a mission. Slow, controlled, ready. A low hum reached his ears. Not a car, not a truck, something bigger. Multiple engines coming from the south. Jake stood, grabbed his rifle, and moved to the door. He cracked it open, peering into the darkness. The first thing he saw was dust, lots of it, rising in thick clouds, kicked up by the tires of an incoming convoy. And then he saw the lights. Not just headlights, spotlights, mounted on the roofs of armored vehicles. They weren't playing anymore. Valdez had sent his entire goddamn army. Jake counted at least 10 trucks, 2 armored SUVs, and at the rear, a goddamn technical with a mounted .50 cal machine gun. They had come to erase him from the earth. Jake stepped back inside, exhaling through his nose. He grabbed the radio, switching it to the cartel's frequency. Static crackled for a moment before a voice came through. Valdez himself. "Senor Mercer," the cartel boss said, his tone amused but laced with something else. Rage. "You have caused me great inconvenience." Jake strapped his chest rig on, stuffing spare magazines into the pouches. "I told you not to come." Valdez chuckled. "And yet, here I am." Jake slung his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed his shotgun. "Then I guess I'll have to send you home in a box." "You are outnumbered, viejo," Valdez said. "You cannot win." Jake walked back to the porch, watching the headlights grow brighter. 50 men, maybe more. A small army. They weren't sneaking in this time. They were making a statement. "You ever hear of the Battle of Kamdesh?" Jake asked, his voice even. A pause. "No?" Jake chambered around into the shotgun. "Then you don't know what one man can do." He dropped the radio, and then the first shot rang out. The attack begins. The convoy didn't stop. They were rolling in full force, knowing that Mercer was alone, believing their numbers would crush him. Jake fired first, leveling the shotgun and sending a slug straight into the windshield of the lead truck. The glass exploded in a spray of shards, and the driver lost control, swerving hard into a ditch. The truck flipped, rolling twice before slamming onto its side. Gunfire erupted immediately. Cartel enforcers jumped from the backs of trucks, spilling onto the dirt road, rifles barking in the night. They spread out, moving with practiced discipline, sweeping the property as they advanced. Jake moved fast, sprinting toward the barn. The moment his boots hit the dirt, the first explosion went off. The claymore mines he had buried ripped through the advancing soldiers, sending bodies flying in all directions. The concussive force threw dust and smoke into the air, masking everything in chaos. Screams echoed across the land. Jake didn't stop moving. He took cover behind a rusted tractor, swapping his shotgun for his MK-18 rifle. The red glow of muzzle flashes lit up the darkness. He fired in controlled bursts, dropping 2 men who were trying to flank the side of the house. The technical with the mounted .50 caliber opened fire, shredding the front of the barn in a storm of bullets. Wood splintered, shrapnel flying like daggers. Jake gritted his teeth. He had to take out that gunner fast. He rolled out from cover, bringing his rifle up, sighting down the scope. The gunner was reloading, a half-second of vulnerability. Jake fired. The round punched through the gunner's face, his body slumping forward over the weapon. The driver tried to flee, throwing the truck into reverse. Jake lobbed a grenade. The explosion ripped the vehicle apart, flipping it onto its roof. Flames swallowed the wreckage. Close quarters, combat. The remaining cartel soldiers weren't running anymore. They were closing in. Jake felt it in his bones. The fight was shifting. He had thinned them out, but now they were inside the wire. They were coming for him, house to house, room to room. He sprinted toward the main house, bullets snapping past him, feeling the heat of gunfire just inches from his back. Bear darted inside ahead of him, barking furiously. Jake slammed the door shut and moved fast, switching positions, clearing the space. Glass shattered as the cartel sent rounds through the windows, trying to suppress him. He crouched low, staying out of the line of fire. Then he heard it. Boots on the wooden porch. They were coming in. Jake flattened himself against the wall near the entrance, shotgun raised. The first man stepped in. Jake blew him off his feet with a single blast. Another came through the back door. Jake spun, emptying the rest of the shells into his chest. The third rushed in too fast. Bear lunged. The dog's teeth sank into the enforcer's arm, dragging him to the floor. The man screamed, trying to shake the dog loose. Jake ended it with a bullet to the head. The house was clear. For now. The final push. Outside, the last few cartel men were regrouping near the remaining trucks. Jake checked his ammo. 1 full mag left. A handful of shells. His knife. Good enough. He kicked open the door, moving low, sweeping left and right, picking off the last enforcers who were still standing. His rifle ran dry, but he kept going, grabbing his sidearm, switching to headshots. The final man tried to run for a truck. Jake caught him by the collar, slammed him onto the hood, and pressed his pistol to his forehead. "You tell Valdez," Jake said, breathing heavy, "that if he sends another man, I'll burn his whole empire down." The enforcer nodded weakly, terror in his eyes. Jake let go. The man scrambled away, climbing into the truck and speeding off into the night. The battlefield was silent now. Jake exhaled. His body ached. His knuckles were bloody. His land was littered with corpses and burning vehicles. Bear sat beside him, panting, ears still alert. Jake knelt, scratching the dog's head. "It's over, boy." But he knew it wasn't. Not yet. Valdez would come himself next time. And when he did, Jake would be waiting. The fires still burned. The wreckage of the cartel's assault lay scattered across Jake Mercer's land, twisted metal and bodies half buried in the desert sand. The acrid smell of burning fuel mixed with the coppery scent of blood. He had seen battlefields like this before, in the mountains of Afghanistan, in the jungles of Colombia, in places most men would never walk away from. But this wasn't a war zone overseas. This was home. Jake stood in the middle of the devastation, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his face streaked with dirt and blood. His chest ached, bruised from the recoil of countless shots fired, his arms heavy with the weight of war. He was getting old, but he wasn't done, not yet. Bear sat at his feet, his thick black fur matted with sweat and dust, ears still perked up, listening. He was waiting, just like Jake, because they both knew what came next. The radio on the dead cartel soldier's vest crackled again, a familiar voice. "Mercer." Jake walked over, knelt down, and picked it up. He pressed the button, letting the silence stretch before speaking. "I'm still here." Valdez let out a slow chuckle. "So are my men, and they're coming for you." Jake wiped sweat from his brow, looking out over the land. The sun was beginning to rise, casting an orange glow over the wreckage. "You've already sent men," he said. "Twice. This time, I'm coming myself." Jake rolled his shoulders, his back cracking from exhaustion. He had been waiting for this. "I was hoping you'd say that." Valdez exhaled. "Disfruta de tu último amanecer, viejo." The radio cut to static. Jake tossed it onto one of the burning trucks and walked back toward the house. He had one more battle to fight, and this time, it wouldn't end until Valdez was dead. Inside, he stripped out of his blood-stained shirt, washed his face at the kitchen sink, and poured himself a fresh cup of coffee. He drank it black, the way he always had, the way his old teammates used to drink it before missions that had no return plan. Bear lay by the door, watching him. The dog knew what was coming. Jake grabbed the crate of spare magazines and began loading them, calm, methodical, the way he always had. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. This was what he did. When he was done, he stood in the center of his home, looking around at the place he had built with his own hands. It had been a sanctuary, a place of peace. But peace didn't last for men like him. He strapped on his chest rig, slung the MK-18 over his shoulder, and grabbed the M24 sniper rifle from its case. He hadn't used it in years. He'd use it now. Bear stood up when Jake opened the door. "Stay close," Jake muttered. Then he walked outside, into the desert, into the last fight of his life. The sun was high when the next wave of Cartel vehicles came into view. Dust curled behind them like a trail of death. 6 SUVs, 2 armored trucks, a dozen men at least. But this wasn't just another hit squad. This was Valdez himself. Jake watched through his rifle scope from his position on the ridge. He had spent the morning setting up traps, reinforcing his fallback positions. He had spent years defending this land from drought, from thieves, from the slow crawl of time. Now, he would defend it with blood. The convoy rolled to a stop near the front gate. The doors opened, and then Hector Valdez stepped out. He wasn't what Jake had expected. He wasn't some fat kingpin in a silk shirt, drowning in gold jewelry. Number Valdez was a soldier, tall, lean, built like a man who had fought for everything he had. He wore a tactical vest, carried a custom pistol on his hip, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. Jake exhaled, steadying his breathing. He could kill him right now. One shot, one pull of the trigger, but not yet. He wanted Valdez to see it happen. Valdez's men spread out, sweeping the property, weapons raised. They moved with precision, not like the grunts from before. These were trained mercenaries. Killers. Valdez cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Mercer!" Jake didn't answer. Valdez chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, viejo. You've killed so many of my men. Don't you want to see who I brought for you?" A second SUV door opened, and then Jake felt his stomach drop. A man stepped out, hands bound, a bloody cut along his cheek. It was Sheriff Roy Dunbar. Jake clenched his jaw. Valdez grinned. "You thought we wouldn't check the town? You thought no one would talk?" He put a hand on Roy's shoulder. "Your friend here tried to keep quiet, but we convinced him." Jake saw it in Roy's face. The bruises, the pain, the regret. The sheriff knew he had been a dead man the second they took him. Valdez raised a pistol, pressed it against Roy's temple, and smiled. "Come out, Mercer," he said, "or I paint your porch with his brains." Jake closed his eyes. He had fought wars for governments that didn't care. He had taken lives in places most people didn't know existed. He had retired to get away from it, to find some kind of peace. But there was no peace. There never had been. He opened his eyes, and then he pulled the trigger. The bullet hit Valdez's wrist, shattering bone, sending his pistol flying into the dirt. He screamed, clutching his ruined hand, blood dripping between his fingers. The mercenaries froze for half a second. Then, chaos. Jake fired again, dropping the first gunman before they could react. He shifted targets, shot a second man in the throat. The rest scrambled for cover, dragging Valdez behind one of the SUVs. Roy collapsed to the ground, still alive, still breathing. The mercenaries opened fire, bullets ripping through the air, kicking up dirt, punching holes in the wooden fence. Jake moved fast. He grabbed the M24, slung it over his shoulder, and switched to his MK-18. This was closer now. Dirt and blood and fire. He rolled behind a boulder as rounds snapped past him, his ears ringing from the gunfire. Bear growled beside him, his fur bristling. "Not yet," Jake muttered. The mercenaries were pushing forward, spreading out, trying to flank. Jake let them. Then he set off the explosives. The entire front gate erupted in fire and shrapnel, sending bodies flying. The armored truck's front end detonated, flipping onto its side. Screams echoed through the desert. Jake moved, fast, precise. He fired in short, controlled bursts, cutting through the last of the mercenaries, dropping them one by one. Blood hit the sand. More bodies, more silence, and then it was just Valdez. The cartel boss staggered forward, his hand still bleeding, his gun gone, his men dead around him. Jake stepped out from behind cover, his rifle raised. Valdez laughed, shaking his head. "You don't have to do this." Jake exhaled. "Yeah, I do." One last shot, and Hector Valdez was gone. The desert was quiet again. Jake holstered his weapon and walked toward Roy, kneeling beside him. The sheriff coughed, spitting blood onto the sand. "Hell of a fight," he muttered. Jake sighed, looking at the bodies around them. "Yeah." Bear sat beside them, ears twitching, his tail wagging once. "It's over," Roy said. Jake looked toward the horizon. The sun was rising. "No," he muttered, "it's just beginning."